The sound of a woman weeping in the wilderness was not something Owen Irving expected to hear that morning in September 1876. But there it was, cutting through the pine-scented air of the Montana Territory like a knife through butter. He'd been tracking elk through the dense forest near Utica, a small mining town tucked into the mountains where civilization barely held on by its fingernails, when the sound reached his ears. Owen stopped dead in his tracks, his rifle lowering as he listened. The crying was desperate, raw with genuine grief, and something in his chest tightened at the sound. He'd spent the last 8 years living alone in these mountains, trapping beaver and hunting game, avoiding people whenever possible after the war had taken everything from him. But this sound, this broken sobbing, pulled at something he thought had died at Gettysburg, moving through the underbrush with the silence of a man who'd learned to walk like the animals he hunted. Owen approached the source of the weeping. His buckskin clothing, worn soft from years of use, made no sound as he moved. His dark hair, which fell past his shoulders, was tied back with a leather cord, and his thick beard was flecked with gray despite him being only 32 years old. The muscles in his arms and chest, built from years of hard labor in the mountains, flexed as he pushed aside low-hanging branches. There, in a small clearing beside a rushing creek, sat a young woman in a traveling dress that had seen better days. She was on her hands and knees, searching through the grass and dirt with frantic movements, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Her dark blonde hair had come loose from its pins and hung in disheveled waves around her face. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features that spoke of a life very different from the harsh mountain existence Owen knew, lost something. His voice came out rougher than he intended, rusty from disuse. The woman's head snapped up, her green eyes wide with fear. She scrambled backward, nearly falling into the creek in her panic. Owen immediately raised his hands, showing he meant no harm, though he knew he must look fearsome, standing 6 feet 4 inches tall, his muscular frame covered in animal skins, a knife at his belt and a rifle in his hand. "I won't hurt you, miss," he said, softer this time. "Just heard you crying, thought you might need help." She stared at him for a long moment, her breathing rapid, clearly weighing whether to run or trust him. Finally, desperation won out over fear. "My locket," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lost my locket. It was my mother's, the only thing I have left of her." Owen looked around the clearing, noting the disturbed earth where she'd been searching. "How long have you been looking?" "Since dawn," she said, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I came here yesterday afternoon to wash my face in the creek. The clasp must have broken. I didn't notice until I got back to town last evening. I've been searching everywhere, but I can't find it." Her voice dissolved into sobs again. Something in Owen's chest cracked at the sight of her despair. He'd known loss, had felt it so deeply he'd run from civilization to escape it. But here was this woman, suffering over something small and precious, something that connected her to someone she'd loved and lost. He understood that pain better than she could know. "What's your name?" he asked, setting his rifle against a tree and moving closer, careful not to spook her. "Eleanor," she said, wiping at her face with muddy hands. "Eleanor Turner. I'm a school teacher. I just arrived in Utica 3 weeks ago." "Owen Irving," he said, crouching down a few feet from where she sat. "I live up in the mountains, trap and hunt mostly. Been here about 8 years now." Eleanor looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Irving. I shouldn't have come out here alone. Everyone in town warned me that the wilderness is dangerous, but I had to try to find it. My mother died 2 years ago, and that locket has her portrait inside. It's all I have to remember her face by." Owen felt something shift inside him, a protective instinct he hadn't felt since before the war, when he'd had a family to protect. Tell me about the locket. What's it look like? It's gold, oval-shaped about this big. She held her fingers apart to show him, with a pattern of flowers engraved on the front. The clasp is delicate, probably why it broke. Owen nodded, his mind already working through the problem. And you're certain you lost it here? I think so. I washed my face right there. She pointed to a smooth rock by the creek's edge. And then I walked along the bank for a while, maybe 50 yards in that direction. She gestured upstream. But I've searched and searched, and I can't find it anywhere. The mountain man studied the area with experienced eyes. The creek was running fast from recent rains, the water clear and cold from mountain snowmelt. If the locket had fallen into the water, it could be anywhere by now, swept downstream or wedged under rocks. If it had fallen on land, it might be buried in the soft earth or hidden in the thick grass that grew along the bank. It's getting dark, Owen said, noting the long shadows stretching across the clearing. You need to get back to town before night falls. These woods aren't safe after dark. But my locket, Eleanor protested, fresh desperation in her voice. I'll look for it, Owen heard himself say, surprising himself as much as her. I'll search proper the way a tracker should. If it's here, I'll find it. Eleanor stared at him, hope flickering in her tear-filled eyes. You do that, for me, but you don't even know me. Owen stood, retrieving his rifle. I know what it's like to lose something precious. Come on, I'll walk you back to town. Can't have the new school teacher getting eaten by a mountain lion on my account. A ghost of a smile touched Eleanor's lips at that, the first hint of lightness in her expression. She accepted his offered hand, and he pulled her to her feet with ease, noting how small and delicate her hand felt in his calloused palm. She barely came up to his chest, and he found himself thinking she looked like a sparrow next to a bear. As they walked back toward Utica, Eleanor told him about herself. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, the only child of a widowed mother who taught her to read and write and encouraged her to become a teacher. When her mother had died of pneumonia 2 years ago, Eleanor had found herself alone in the world, with no other family and few prospects. Teaching positions in the East were scarce and poorly paid, so when she'd seen the advertisement for a schoolteacher needed in Montana territory, she'd scraped together enough money for the train fare and headed west. I thought it would be an adventure, she said with a sad laugh. A new beginning. But it's been harder than I imagined. The people are kind enough, but everything is so rough here, so harsh. I miss my mother every day, and that locket, seeing her face, it was the only thing that made me feel less alone. Owen listened, his long strides shortened to match her pace. He found himself noticing things about her. The determined set of her jaw despite her sadness, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she didn't complain about the difficult walk through the forest even though her dress was torn and muddy, and she had to be exhausted from hours of searching. Philadelphia is a long way from Montana, he said. That took courage, coming all this way alone. Eleanor glanced up at him, surprised. Most people think I'm foolish. Foolish would be giving up on something that matters to you. Brave is doing it anyway, even when it's hard. They emerged from the forest as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Utica spread out before them, a collection of rough wooden buildings clustered around a main street, with mining operations scarring the hillsides beyond. It wasn't much to look at, but it was civilization of a sort, and Owen felt the familiar discomfort of being around people creeping over him. I live in a room behind the schoolhouse, Eleanor said, pointing to a small white building at the edge of town. Mr. Irving, are you certain you're willing to search for my locket? I have a little money saved I could pay you. No payment needed, Owen said gruffly. I'll start searching at first light tomorrow. If I find it, I'll bring it to the schoolhouse. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed to be tears of gratitude rather than despair. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're very kind." Owen grunted, uncomfortable with the praise. He wasn't kind. Kind men didn't run away from the world and hide in the mountains. But he nodded to her and turned back toward the forest, feeling her eyes on him as he walked away. That night, in his small cabin miles up in the mountains, Owen couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Eleanor Turner, about the grief in her eyes and the desperate way she'd searched for that locket. He thought about his own mother, dead now for 20 years, and wondered if he'd had something like that locket, something to remember her by. Would he have held on to it as fiercely as Eleanor wanted to hold on to hers? Before dawn, he was up and heading back down the mountain. He reached the creek just as the sun was rising, painting the water gold and pink. For the first time in years, Owen found himself caring about something beyond basic survival. He had a mission, a purpose, and the unfamiliar feeling of wanting to help someone. He started where Eleanor had indicated, at the smooth rock where she'd washed her face. Working methodically, he examined every inch of ground, every crevice in the rocks, every clump of grass. His eyes, trained by years of tracking animals through dense forest, missed nothing. He waded into the creek, the icy water soaking his buckskin pants, and felt along the bottom, checking under rocks and in the spaces where debris collected. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher. Owen worked in a grid pattern, covering the area she described and then expanding outward. He found plenty of things. A rusty nail, some colored pebbles, the skeleton of a small bird, but no locket. As afternoon approached, he sat back on his heels, thinking. If the locket had fallen into the creek and been swept downstream, he needed to follow the water. But it was delicate, made of soft gold. It wouldn't have gone far before snagging on something. He spent the rest of the day walking downstream, examining both banks, checking every place where debris had collected, every tangle of roots and rocks. When darkness fell, he was forced to stop, but he marked his spot and headed back to his cabin with determination burning in his chest. The second day was much like the first. Owen returned to the creek at dawn and continued his search downstream. The forest was quiet around him, just the sound of rushing water and bird song. He thought about Eleanor as he searched, wondering what she was doing, if she was teaching her students, if she'd given up hope of ever seeing her locket again. The creek widened as he moved downstream, the current slowing. Here the water had carved deep pools, and the banks were thick with willows and cattails. Owen waded through the shallows, his sharp eyes scanning everything. He found a muskrat den, a tangle of fishing line that must have washed down from somewhere upstream, an old boot so rotted it fell apart when he touched it, but no locket. As the second day drew to a close, Owen felt frustration building. He was good at tracking, had found wounded animals that had run miles before collapsing, had located lost equipment in acres of forest. But this tiny piece of jewelry was proving elusive. Still, he'd promised Eleanor he would search, and he wasn't a man who broke his word. That evening, he stopped at a general store at the edge of Utica to buy supplies. The owner, a garrulous man named Pete who seemed to know everyone's business, eyed Owen with curiosity. "Heard you walked Miss Turner back from the woods yesterday," Pete said as he wrapped Owen's purchases. "That was decent of you. She's a nice young lady, too educated for this rough place maybe, but she's got grit. Already got those mining kids reading better than they ever have." Owen grunted non-committally, not wanting to encourage conversation, but Pete wasn't deterred. "She was in here yesterday afternoon, looked like she'd been crying. Asked if anyone had found a locket. Described it as real precious to her. I told her if it turned up, I'd let her know, but things lost in these mountains usually stay lost." "Usually," Owen agreed, gathering his supplies. But as he left the store, he thought about Eleanor's face, about the raw grief in her expression, and he knew he wasn't ready to give up yet. The third day dawned clear and cold, with frost on the ground and mist rising from the creek. Owen started even earlier, reaching the water while stars still glittered in the sky. He decided to try a different approach. Instead of following the creek downstream, he would search the forest floor around the entire area where Eleanor had walked, thinking maybe the locket had caught on her dress and fallen off later, away from the water. He moved through the underbrush like a shadow, examining the ground inch by inch. The morning passed slowly. Around midday, as the sun finally burned through the mist, Owen found himself in a thicket of wild roses about 30 yards from the creek. The bushes were thick and tangled, and he almost passed them by, but something made him look closer. There, caught on a low branch about a foot off the ground, glinting in a shaft of sunlight, was the locket. Owen's heart jumped in his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it as excitement. He carefully untangled the delicate chain from the thorns, holding the locket up to examine it. It was exactly as Eleanor had described, oval-shaped gold with flowers engraved on the front. The clasp was indeed broken, which explained how it had fallen off. He opened it with careful fingers, and there inside was a small painted portrait of a woman who looked remarkably like Eleanor, with the same green eyes and determined chin. Relief flooded through him, followed by something else, something warm and bright that he hadn't felt in years. He'd found it. He'd kept his promise. He could return this precious thing to Eleanor and ease her grief. Owen started back toward Utica immediately, the locket secure in his pocket. It was early afternoon, and if he hurried, he could reach the schoolhouse before Eleanor finished teaching for the day. The walk down the mountain felt shorter than usual, his steps quick with purpose. Utica was quiet as he entered the main street, most people at work in the mines or at home. The schoolhouse sat at the far end of town, a fresh painted white building that stood out among the weathered gray structures around it. Owen could hear voices as he approached, children reciting something in unison. He stopped outside the door, suddenly uncertain. He was filthy from 3 days in the wilderness, covered in mud and creek water with scratches on his hands from the rose thorns. He probably looked like a wild man, but he'd come this far, and he had what Eleanor wanted most. Taking a deep breath, Owen knocked on the door. The recitation stopped. There was a moment of silence, then footsteps. The door opened and Eleanor stood there, dressed in a simple gray dress with her hair pinned up neatly. Her eyes widened when she saw him. "Mr. Irving," she said, surprise and something else, something hopeful in her voice. Behind her, Owen could see about 15 children of various ages sitting at wooden desks, all staring at him with wide eyes. He felt acutely uncomfortable under their scrutiny, but he focused on Eleanor's face. "Found it," he said simply, pulling the locket from his pocket and holding it out to her. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, and tears immediately spilled down her cheeks. She took the locket with trembling fingers, staring at it as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "You found it," she whispered. "You actually found it." She opened it, looking at her mother's portrait, and a sob escaped her. 3 days. You searched for 3 days." "Said I would," Owen replied, shifting his weight, aware of all the children watching. Eleanor looked up at him, and the expression on her face made something in Owen's chest tighten. It was gratitude, yes, but also something more, something deeper. She was looking at him like he'd hung the moon. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This means everything to me. Everything. You've given me back the only piece of my mother I have left." "Glad I could help," Owen said, feeling heat creep up his neck. He wasn't used to this, to being looked at with such open warmth and appreciation. One of the older students, a boy of about 12, piped up from the back of the room. "Did you really search for 3 whole days, mister?" Owen glanced at the boy and nodded. "Yes." "In the wilderness?" another child asked, awe in her voice. "That's where it was lost," Owen said. The children erupted with questions, all talking at once, fascinated by this mountain man who'd appeared at their schoolhouse. Eleanor laughed through her tears, holding up a hand for silence. "Children, please. Mr. Irving has been very kind, but I'm sure he needs to get home and rest." She turned back to Owen, her eyes still shining with tears. "Will you at least let me make you dinner? As a thank you. It's the least I can do." Owen's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back to his cabin and his solitary life. But looking at Eleanor's hopeful face, thinking about the 3 days he'd spent searching and the warm feeling in his chest when he'd found the locket, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said. "Dinner would be fine." Eleanor's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Wonderful." "School finishes at 3. My rooms are just behind the schoolhouse. Would 4 o'clock work?" "I'll be here," Owen agreed. He left then, walking back toward the forest, but instead of heading up the mountain to his cabin, he found himself going to the creek. He needed to wash, to clean up before dinner. The fact that he cared about his appearance surprised him. It had been years since he'd given any thought to how he looked, but the idea of sitting down to dinner with Eleanor Turner, covered in 3 days of mud and grime, suddenly seemed wrong. He stripped off his buckskin shirt and waded into the creek, scrubbing at his face and arms with cold water. He couldn't do much about his clothes, but at least he could be clean. He even untied his hair and washed it, then combed it back with his fingers and retied it. His reflection in the still water showed a man he barely recognized, someone with purpose in his eyes instead of the hollow emptiness that had lived there for so long. At precisely 4 o'clock, Owen knocked on the door at the back of the schoolhouse. Eleanor answered immediately, and he was struck again by how pretty she was, especially now with joy lighting up her face. She changed into a blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and the locket hung around her neck where it clearly belonged. "Come in, please," she said, stepping aside. Her rooms were small but tidy, a main room that served as kitchen and sitting area with a door leading to what must be a bedroom. A table was set with 2 plates, and something smelled delicious, making Owen's stomach growl. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a home-cooked meal. "I hope you like stew," Eleanor said, ladling food into bowls. "It's not fancy, but it's hearty." "Stew is perfect," Owen said, taking a seat at the table. The chair felt too small for his large frame, but he managed. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Owen savoring the rich flavors of the stew. Eleanor had added herbs he couldn't identify, and the meat was tender and flavorful. It was a far cry from the simple fare he usually prepared for himself. "This is very good," he said, and Eleanor smiled. "My mother taught me to cook. She said a woman should be able to make a home wherever she is, even in difficult circumstances." Her hand went to the locket at her neck. "I miss her so much. Sometimes I talk to her portrait, tell her about my day." "I know it's silly." "It's not silly," Owen said firmly. "I lost my mother when I was young and my father not long after. Then the war took my 2 brothers and my best friend, lost a lot of good men at Gettysburg." He paused, surprised at himself. He never talked about the war, never mentioned his past. But something about Eleanor made him want to share, to open up the locked places in his heart. Eleanor reached across the table and touched his hand gently. "I'm sorry, that must have been terrible." "It was," Owen admitted. "After the war ended, I couldn't go back home. Too many memories, too many ghosts, so I came west, kept going until I found these mountains. Been here ever since, mostly alone." "That's a lonely life," Eleanor said softly. "Easier than the alternative," Owen replied. "Or so I thought. And now—" He looked at her, at the kindness in her eyes, at the way she was looking at him like he was someone worth knowing. "Now I'm not so sure." They talked through dinner and into the evening. Eleanor told him about her students, about the challenges of teaching children who'd never had formal education before, about her plans to start a lending library with books she'd brought from Philadelphia. Owen told her about the mountains, about tracking animals and reading weather in the clouds, about the harsh beauty of winter up in the high country. Time seemed to slip away, and Owen was startled when he glanced out the window and saw full darkness had fallen. He stood reluctantly. "I should go. Don't want to keep you up too late." Eleanor stood as well, walking him to the door. "Thank you again, Mr. Irving, not just for finding my locket but for dinner tonight. I've been lonely here and it was nice to have company to talk to someone." "Owen," he said. "You can call me Owen." "Then you must call me Eleanor," she replied, smiling. She hesitated, then said, "Would you like to come to dinner again? Perhaps next week. I could make chicken if I can get one from Mrs. Henderson." Owen knew he should refuse, knew he should retreat to his mountain and his solitary life. But he found himself nodding instead. "I'd like that." Eleanor's smile was radiant. "Next Saturday then, same time." "I'll be here," Owen promised. As he walked back into the darkness, heading for his cabin under a sky full of stars, Owen felt something he hadn't felt in years: anticipation. He was already looking forward to Saturday, to seeing Eleanor again, to hearing her voice and watching the animated way she talked when she was excited about something. The week passed slowly for Owen. He went about his usual routine, checking his trap lines, hunting for meat to smoke for the coming winter, but his mind kept drifting to Eleanor. He found himself wondering what she was doing, if she was thinking about him, if Saturday would ever arrive. When Saturday finally came, Owen spent extra time getting ready. He washed thoroughly in the creek, trimmed his beard with his hunting knife, and even put on his better buckskin shirt, the one without holes or stains. He felt foolish, like a young man courting for the first time, but he couldn't seem to help himself. Eleanor greeted him with obvious pleasure, her face lighting up when she opened the door. She had indeed managed to get a chicken, and she'd roasted it with potatoes and carrots. The meal was delicious, but Owen found he was more interested in watching Eleanor talk than in eating. She had a way of gesturing with her hands when she was excited, and her eyes sparkled when she laughed. After dinner, they sat together at the table, talking until late into the night again. This time, when Owen left, he didn't wait for an invitation. "Same time next week?" he asked. Eleanor nodded happily. "I'll be counting the days." So began a pattern that continued through September and into October. Every Saturday, Owen came down from his mountain to have dinner with Eleanor. Sometimes she cooked, sometimes he brought fresh meat and they cooked together. They talked about everything: their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Owen found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, and Eleanor did the same. He learned that she'd been engaged once, back in Philadelphia, to a man her mother had approved of. But the man had broken the engagement when Eleanor's mother got sick, unwilling to take on the responsibility of a dying woman's care. Eleanor had cared for her mother alone for 6 months, watching her waste away, and had been left with nothing but debts and the locket when she died. "I thought I loved him," Eleanor said one evening, referring to her former fiancé. "But now I realize I was just lonely, wanting someone to share my life with. When he left, I was hurt, but I wasn't heartbroken. I think real love should break your heart if you lose it, don't you?" Owen thought about the war, about watching his brothers die, about the pain that had driven him into the wilderness. "Yes," he said quietly, "real love cuts deep." Eleanor looked at him with understanding in her eyes, and Owen felt seen in a way he hadn't in years. As the weeks passed, Owen began to realize what was happening. He was falling in love with Eleanor Turner. The thought terrified him. He'd built his life around being alone, around not caring, around not letting anyone close enough to hurt him. But Eleanor had slipped past his defenses without him even noticing, and now the thought of losing her was unbearable. He started coming to town more often, not just on Saturdays. He'd stop by the schoolhouse to bring Eleanor things: fresh venison, wildflowers he'd found in the meadows, interesting stones from the creek. The children got used to seeing him, and they'd rush to the windows when he appeared, fascinated by the quiet mountain man who'd befriended their teacher. Eleanor began to teach Owen to read better. He could read a little enough to get by, but she opened up a whole new world for him with the books she shared. They'd sit together in the evenings, Eleanor reading aloud while Owen listened, her voice bringing stories to life. One cold October evening, after Eleanor had finished reading a chapter from a novel about knights and ladies, Owen took her hand. His heart was pounding, and he felt more nervous than he'd ever been facing down a bear. "Eleanor," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "These past weeks, getting to know you, it's changed something in me. You've brought light into a life that's been dark for a long time." Eleanor's eyes were wide, her hand trembling in his. "Owen, I feel the same way. When you found my locket, when you searched for 3 days just to ease my grief, I started to see what kind of man you really are. You're good and kind and strong, and being with you makes me happier than I've been since my mother died." Owen lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I never thought I'd care about anyone again. I thought that part of me died in the war, but you've made me feel alive again, Eleanor. You've made me want things I thought I'd given up on." "What things?" she whispered. "A home, a family, a future." He paused, gathering his courage. "I'm not a rich man, Eleanor. I live rough in the mountains. I can't offer you the kind of life you had in Philadelphia, but I can offer you my heart, my protection, everything I am. I love you, Eleanor Turner. I think I started loving you the moment I heard you crying over that locket and realized how much capacity for love you had in you, how deeply you felt things." Tears were streaming down Eleanor's face, but she was smiling. "I don't want the life I had in Philadelphia. I want this right here with you. I love you too, Owen Irving. You're the strongest, bravest, most honorable man I've ever known." Owen pulled her into his arms, holding her against his chest. She fit perfectly there, like she'd been made to be in his embrace. When he tilted her face up and kissed her for the first time, it felt like coming home after a long journey through darkness. They held each other for a long time, neither wanting to let go. Finally, Owen pulled back enough to look into her eyes. "Marry me, Eleanor. Be my wife. I'll build us a proper cabin big enough for a family. I'll keep you safe and warm and loved for the rest of my days." "Yes," Eleanor said without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at the edge of Utica. The whole town turned out, curious to see the mountain man marry the schoolteacher. Eleanor wore a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, and she carried wildflowers that Owen had gathered from the high meadows. The locket hung around her neck, her mother's portrait watching over her on this important day. Owen wore new clothes for the occasion, buckskin pants, and a shirt that Eleanor had helped him pick out from the general store. His hair was neatly tied back, and he'd trimmed his beard. He stood at the altar, this huge, powerful man with hands that could kill a bear, trembling like a leaf as Eleanor walked down the aisle toward him. When she reached him and took his hands, he felt his heart might burst from his chest. This beautiful, educated, gentle woman was choosing him, choosing a life in the rough mountains over everything she'd known before. The minister spoke the words of the ceremony, but Owen barely heard them. He was lost in Eleanor's eyes, in the love he saw shining there. "I do," he said when prompted, his voice strong and sure. "I do," Eleanor echoed, squeezing his hands. "You may kiss your bride," the minister said with a smile. Owen pulled Eleanor close and kissed her tenderly, aware of all the eyes on them but caring only about the woman in his arms. When they broke apart, Eleanor was laughing and crying at the same time, and Owen felt like the luckiest man alive. True to his word, Owen had spent the 3 weeks before the wedding building a new cabin. It was larger than his old one, with a proper bedroom and a big main room with a stone fireplace. He chinked the logs carefully to keep out the winter cold and built furniture for their home. A real bed, a table and chairs, shelves for Eleanor's books. The cabin was situated in a beautiful spot, on a ridge with a view of the valley below. A creek ran nearby, the same creek where Owen had found Eleanor's locket, and there were meadows full of wildflowers in the summer. It was remote, miles from town, but Eleanor said it was perfect. They spent their first night as husband and wife in their new home, with snow beginning to fall outside, covering the world in white. Eleanor stood at the window, wrapped in a quilt, watching the snow fall. Owen came up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her, and she leaned back against his chest with a contented sigh. "Happy?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. "More than I ever thought possible," Eleanor replied. "I came west looking for a new beginning, and I found so much more. I found home. I found love. I found you." Owen turned her in his arms, looking down at her face in the firelight. "I spent years running from life, from feeling anything. I thought being alone was easier than risking pain, but you showed me that a life without love isn't really living at all. You saved me, Eleanor, just as surely as I found your locket." "We saved each other," Eleanor said, reaching up to touch his bearded face. "Two lonely people who found their way to each other." That night, wrapped in each other's arms before the fire, they began their life together. Owen was gentle and patient, treating Eleanor with reverence, amazed that she was his, that she'd chosen him. Eleanor discovered strength in vulnerability, safety in surrender, and a depth of feeling she hadn't known existed. The winter was harsh that year, with heavy snows that sometimes kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. But they didn't mind. Owen taught Eleanor how to cure hides and make candles, how to read tracks in the snow and predict weather changes. Eleanor continued teaching Owen to read better, and they spent long evenings before the fire with her books, discovering new worlds together. In the spring, Eleanor announced she was pregnant. Owen was overwhelmed with joy and terror in equal measure. The thought of being a father thrilled and frightened him. What if something went wrong? What if he lost Eleanor the way he'd lost everyone else he'd loved? Eleanor saw his fear and took his hands in hers. "I'm strong, Owen. My mother had an easy time with me, and I have you to take care of me. Everything will be fine." Still, as her pregnancy progressed, Owen was extra careful with her, almost comically so. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy or walk too far. Eleanor alternated between being touched by his concern and exasperated by his overprotectiveness. "Owen, I'm having a baby, not dying," she said one day when he'd insisted she rest instead of helping him in the garden they'd planted near the cabin. "I know," he said, looking sheepish. "I just can't bear the thought of anything happening to you. You're my whole world, Eleanor." She softened at that, pulling him down for a kiss. "And you're mine, but you have to trust that I know my own body, that I'll tell you if something's wrong." As summer turned to fall, Eleanor's belly grew round and full. She'd had to stop teaching at the school, which made her sad, but the town had promised to hold her position until she was ready to return. In the meantime, she spent her days making clothes for the baby and preparing the cabin for their new arrival. On a crisp October morning, almost exactly a year after Owen had asked Eleanor to marry him, their son was born. The birth was long and difficult, and Owen aged years in those hours, holding Eleanor's hand and praying to a God he hadn't spoken to since the war. But finally, just as the sun was rising, a baby's cry filled the cabin. Owen looked down at his son, so tiny and perfect, and felt tears streaming down his face. Eleanor was exhausted but radiant, holding their baby against her chest. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "He has your eyes." "And your nose," Owen said, touching the baby's tiny hand with one large finger. The baby grasped it, and Owen's heart melted completely. "What should we name him?" Eleanor smiled. "I was thinking Thomas, after my father, Thomas Irving." "Thomas," Owen repeated, trying out the name. "I like it. Thomas Irving." He leaned down and kissed Eleanor's forehead. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for loving me, for giving me a family again. I never thought I'd have this, and it's more precious than anything I could have imagined." Little Thomas was a healthy, happy baby who grew quickly. He had Owen's dark hair and Eleanor's green eyes, and he was the center of their world. Owen was a devoted father, carrying Thomas everywhere in a sling Eleanor had made, talking to him constantly even though the baby couldn't understand. Eleanor would laugh at the sight of her huge, muscular husband being so gentle with their tiny son. As Thomas grew into a toddler, Owen taught him about the mountains, about respecting nature and living in harmony with the wilderness. Eleanor taught him his letters and numbers, determined that their son would be educated even though they lived far from town. 2 years after Thomas was born, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Mary Rose, after both their mothers. Mary had Eleanor's blonde hair and Owen's solid build, and she was fearless from the start, toddling after her father and brother with determination. The cabin that Owen had built grew larger over the years, with additional rooms added as the family expanded. They had 2 more children, another son named James and a daughter named Catherine. The cabin rang with laughter and noise, with the sound of children playing and learning and growing. Owen never quite lost his protective instinct, especially with his daughters, but Eleanor helped him find balance. "You can't keep them in a bubble, Owen," she'd say gently when he worried about them riding horses or climbing trees. "They need to learn to be strong, to take risks. You taught me that when you showed me the mountains." As the years passed, Owen and Eleanor's love only deepened. They'd been through hard times together. Brutal winters when food ran low, illnesses that scared them, the everyday challenges of raising children in the wilderness. But they'd also had countless moments of joy, watching their children take their first steps, celebrating holidays around their table, sitting together on the porch in the evenings while the sun set over the mountains. The story of how they'd met became family legend. Owen still had Eleanor's locket, which she'd given to Mary Rose on her 16th birthday. "This locket brought your father and me together," Eleanor told her daughter. "He searched for 3 days to find it, and in doing so, he found his way into my heart." When Thomas was 20 and ready to start his own life, Owen took him up into the high country, just the 2 of them. They camped under the stars, and Owen told his son stories about the war, about the darkness he'd carried for so long, and about how Eleanor had saved him. "Your mother taught me that love is worth the risk of pain," Owen said, staring into the campfire. "I was so afraid of losing people that I stopped living, but she showed me that a life without love, without connection, without taking chances on people, is no life at all. Remember that, son. When you find someone who makes you want to be better, who sees the good in you even when you can't see it yourself. Hold on to them. Love them with everything you have." Thomas listened seriously, his young face thoughtful. "Is that how you knew Mother was the one?" "When you found her crying over the locket." Owen considered this. "I think I knew the moment I decided to help her, when I could have just walked away. Something in me recognized something in her, a kindness and strength and capacity for love that called to parts of me I thought were dead. And then, when I spent those 3 days searching, I realized I wasn't just searching for a locket. I was searching for a reason to come back to life, to be part of the world again. Your mother was that reason." The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Thomas married a woman from town and built his own cabin nearby. Mary Rose became a teacher like her mother, taking over the school in Utica when Eleanor decided to retire. James became a rancher, and Catherine married a doctor who came west to set up practice in Utica. Owen and Eleanor grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love remaining constant. They still lived in the cabin Owen had built, though their children worried about them being so far from town. "We're fine right here," Eleanor would insist when they suggested moving to Utica. "This is our home. This is where our life together began." On a warm summer evening, when Owen was 68 and Eleanor was 59, they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. Their grandchildren were playing in the meadow, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Eleanor's hand was clasped in Owen's, their fingers intertwined as they'd been for over 30 years. "You remember the day we met?" Eleanor asked, a smile in her voice. "Every detail," Owen replied. "I heard you crying, and something in that sound broke through the walls I'd built around myself. I found you searching for your locket, looking so small and lost and desperate. And you spent 3 days looking for it," Eleanor continued. 3 days in the wilderness, searching for something tiny that belonged to a stranger. I fell in love with you during those 3 days, even though you weren't there. I fell in love with your kindness, your dedication, the way you kept your word." Owen turned to look at his wife, seeing past the lines and gray hair to the beautiful young woman who'd stolen his heart all those years ago. "Finding that locket was the best thing I ever did. It led me to you, to this life, to everything that matters." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder. "My mother's locket brought us together. She would have loved you, Owen. She would have been so happy to know that her daughter found a man who loves her as much as you love me. And she would have been proud of the woman you became," Owen said, kissing the top of her head. "You're an amazing mother, a wonderful teacher, the strongest person I know. You took a broken man and made him whole again." "We healed each other," Eleanor corrected gently. "I was broken too, remember? Alone and grieving and lost. You gave me purpose, gave me love, gave me a family and a home. You showed me what true strength looks like, not running from pain but facing it, working through it, choosing love even when it's scary." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower. Their grandchildren had moved closer, and they could hear them clearly now, arguing good-naturedly about some game they were playing. Thomas and his wife were walking up the path, bringing dinner. Mary Rose and her husband were right behind them. It was a weekly tradition now, Sunday dinners at the big cabin, with all the children and grandchildren gathered around the table Owen had built so many years ago. As the family gathered, and the cabin filled with noise and warmth and love, Owen caught Eleanor's eye across the crowded room. She smiled at him, that special smile that was just for him, and touched the locket at her neck. She still wore it every day, her mother's portrait a reminder of where she'd come from and how far she'd traveled to find her home. Owen smiled back, his heart full to bursting. He'd spent years in the wilderness, running from life, convinced that solitude was safer than connection. But Eleanor had shown him the truth. That love, despite the risk of loss, despite the vulnerability it required, was what made life worth living. He thought about that September morning so long ago, about hearing a woman weeping in the forest, about making the choice to help instead of walking away. That single choice had changed everything, had led him from darkness into light, from isolation into community, from mere survival into a life rich with love and meaning. As the evening wore on and the family shared food and stories and laughter, Owen understood that this was what he'd been searching for all along, even during those years when he thought he wanted to be alone. This warmth, this connection, this sense of belonging, of being part of something larger than himself. Eleanor had given him all of this, but it had started with a locket, with 3 days of searching, with a promise kept. Sometimes, Owen reflected, the smallest gestures lead to the biggest changes. Sometimes helping a stranger leads to finding your soulmate. Sometimes the thing you're searching for isn't what you thought it was at all. Years later, when Owen was on his deathbed at the age of 75, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, Eleanor held his hand just as she'd done countless times before. She was crying, but trying to be strong for him. "Don't cry, my love," Owen whispered, his voice weak but his eyes clear. "I've had a good life, a full life, all because of you. I'm not afraid, I'm grateful." "I don't want to lose you," Eleanor said, tears streaming down her face. "You won't lose me," Owen assured her. "I'll always be with you, just like your mother is always with you. Love doesn't end, Eleanor, it just changes form." He pulled her close, and she laid her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat, the same strong, steady rhythm she'd been listening to for over 40 years. Their children stood around them, holding each other, knowing they were witnessing the end of a great love story, but also celebrating everything their parents had built together. Owen's last words were for Eleanor. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for loving me. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for 3 days of searching that led to a lifetime of joy." Eleanor lifted her head and kissed him one last time. "I would search for you for 3,000 days if I had to. I would search forever. You're my heart, Owen Irving. You always will be." Owen smiled, squeezed her hand, and closed his eyes. He passed peacefully, surrounded by love, secure in the knowledge that he'd lived well, that he'd loved deeply, and that he'd been loved in return. Eleanor lived for another 8 years after Owen's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She never remarried, telling people that she'd had her great love and needed no other. She spent her final years teaching the youngest grandchildren to read, tending the garden she and Owen had planted together, and sitting on the porch of the cabin, remembering. She wore the locket every day until the day she died, her mother's portrait a constant companion. When she passed away quietly in her sleep at the age of 83, her family found a letter she'd written, to be read after her death. In it, she told the whole story of how she and Owen had met, of the 3 days he'd spent searching for her locket, of the love that had grown between them. She wrote about the importance of kindness, of keeping your word, of being willing to help strangers, of taking chances on love even when you're afraid. "Your grandfather and I came from different worlds," she wrote. "He was a mountain man, I was a city girl. He was rough and scarred by war, I was sheltered and naive. But we found common ground in our loneliness, in our losses, and ultimately in our love for each other. He taught me strength. I taught him hope. Together, we built a life that was better than anything either of us could have created alone." That's what love does. It makes you better. It makes you whole. Never settle for less than that. Never give up on finding it. And when you find it, hold on tight and never let go. The letter became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations along with the locket that had started it all. The story of Owen and Eleanor was told and retold, a reminder that love can find you in the most unexpected places, that kindness matters, that keeping your promises can change your life, and that sometimes the act of searching for something lost can lead you to find everything you never knew you needed. In Utica, which eventually grew from a rough mining town into a thriving community, there stands a monument to Eleanor Turner Irving, the teacher who educated generations of children. Beside it is a plaque honoring Owen Irving, the mountain man who showed that true strength lies in gentleness, that real courage is choosing love over fear, and that the measure of a man is in the promises he keeps. And sometimes, on quiet mornings in the Montana mountains, when the mist rises from the creeks and the sun paints the sky gold, people say you can hear an echo of laughter from that first cabin, where two lonely souls found each other and built a love that lasted beyond death, beyond time, a love that started with 3 days of searching and bloomed into a lifetime of joy.